Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 5th chapter of the book of Proverbs. Herein we read of the strange, alternately translated as the immoral woman, who receives passing mention in the 2nd chapter, 16th verse. This entire chapter is devoted to avoiding the destructive path of succumbing to her lures. Also, the 7th chapter warns against the sin of adultery, and it's easy. Adultery is not a sin most of us technically commit, yet in the New Testament we are warned that to commit adultery with the lust of the eyes, John 2:16, and to commit adultery in the heart, to lust after a woman with her eyes, or even females too, they often lust after us with their eyes. They are equally liable, perhaps not as extensively as men are, but they are creatures of flesh with sexual urges and desires. So it's, adultery really begins in the heart and begins in the thoughts. And so in some sense, we are all adulterers. We've all lusted after the opposite sex at one point in our life. And sex can be an idol. An idol is any source of supreme satisfaction that you seek outside of Yahweh for your preeminent source of satisfaction. So there are warnings, there are consequences. Not all of them are immediate, but they are there, and that is why they are warned against, not only in this chapter, but throughout the Old and New Testament, the Bible itself. So the opening verse reads, "My son, listen to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding." So he prefaces this much in the same way that he does the 4th and 6th chapter, by calling on the son. That is, this is written to his son. These are guidelines and instructions to instill the principles of wise leadership for the son he was grooming to be his heir apparent. May we all profit from these lessons more so than Solomon's unworthy son Rehoboam did not. And just because everything in Scripture is not written to us does not mean that it's not written for us. These lessons, though they are not, he did not write it with us in mind. It's questionable to what extent he had posterity in mind, but they are valuable nevertheless for all people of all ages. And to listen to his wisdom, we have to seek and gravitate after the words of the wise in order to benefit from it. And understanding lays at the foundation of wisdom. They are closely connected. "So as to watch over discretion, and your lips guard knowledge." This is the lips guarding knowledge is the task of the priest in Malachi 2:16. But our lips ought to be expressions of knowledge. They should communicate what we know in knowledge and discretion. Now that is something that adultery, you better have discretion if you plan to get away with it, but ultimately you can't get away with it, because as we eventually read, even if we deceive the whole world, Yahweh, who looks on high from heaven, nothing escapes his notice. "For the lips of a strange woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil." So the seductive temptation of this strange woman, that means a woman who is not one's wife. It means you are estranged from her via marriage. You are not related to her via marriage. So it can be not necessarily limited to adultery, but also the sin of fornication, which adultery is between at least one person who is married. Fornication is premarital sex. But the lips, the kiss is where it all begins. And once they lay their lips on you, they pretty much have you. And it does taste sweet like honey and smoother than oil. But in the end, she is as bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. So what begins with an enticing and delightful taste in one's mouth, it actually ends up, it does not end well. It's bitter as wormwood. Honey is sweet, wormwood is the bitterest taste imaginable, and two-edged sword that has deadly entailments and connotations. So he ultimately concludes the final verse or somewhere near the final verse, he says that the way of the adulteress and to follow and to succumb to her seductions results in death, spiritual death, if not physical death. "Her feet go down to death. Her steps lay hold of the grave. So the path of adultery does not lead to life. We often think it will improve our life by giving us satisfying, immediate gratification, but in the end, it's something we'll have to live with. And even though the short-term satisfaction is there, the long-term consequences lead us on the path to death and the grave and hell. So there is a spiritual death. Now, very few people died from adultery. I guess some people, older people die from the stimulation of sex their heart gives out, but most of us don't think of adultery in life or death terms, but spiritually speaking, it is a life or death terms. She does not consider the path of life. Her ways are unstable. You do not know it. So women are mysterious, and you can spend your entire life in the company of one and still figure out not everything there is to know or understand about them. But the adulteress is not mindful of the path of life. They lead to the way of death and destruction and damnation. And a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways, we read of in James 1:8. So similarly is the adulteress. She is double-minded. She is divided in loyalty between her husband and her peccadillo, her sexual selection that she seeks to seduce. So now listen to me, you children, and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. This reiterates much of what we read in the opening verse. He has something important to say, so he prefaces it with, listen to me, children. He is speaking as an elder to instruct the younger who lack his wisdom, knowledge, and experience that can only come from wisdom of age. In adultery, the young are especially susceptible to the seduction of the adulteress. And do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Now, what he has to say is something beneficial, so don't treat it, don't turn away from it, don't retreat from it, don't discard it, don't dismiss it, but listen to it. Keep your way far from her, and do not come near the door of her house. So once you have a foot in the door, you're pretty much hers, and she will inflict spiritual harm and injury to you because it's just spiritual death. Sin is spiritual death, and it ultimately leads to eternal death. So stay as far away from possible. Keep yourselves at deliberate remove from her house. If she comes to you, you have to withstand the temptation of her flattering deceptions, but don't actually come to her. Stay as far away from possible as her house, because once you've set foot in the door, you're pretty much hers, and she will do her way with you and have her desire, and you think it's your desire, but it's actually something you would not desire if you knew the full consequences and the thought of it in long-term vision. Lest you give your splendor to others, and your years to one who is cruel. So this can speak of prostitution, to surrender one's wealth. Prostitution is an expensive habit, but those who are addicted to sex will in fact pay for it, and even those who are sex-starved or sex-deprived will seek it by paying, but it's the priceless treasure is marriage and sex. Solomon has very positive things to say about the ideal wife in the 31st proverb, verses 10 all the way till the end, and also in Song of Solomon 4:10, he compares married sex as sweeter than wine. Lest strangers be filled with your strength, and your labor goes into the house of a foreigner. So to pay for sex, you're surrendering all that you worked for, all that you earn, to the house of a foreigner. That is a strange woman. A foreigner is not necessarily someone of a different ethnicity, but someone who is outside of your marriage, one who you are not related to by marriage, and you don't want to spend any of your hard-earned money enriching her and impoverishing yourself. So people seek sexual satisfaction, because they think it will enrich and improve their lives, when all it does is degrade when it comes outside of the parameters of marriage. Then you shall howl in your latter end, when your flesh and your body are consumed. So this does not often enter into the calculation of the one who is considering adultery or seeking sexual satisfaction outside of the parameters of marriage. They're going to howl in the end in bitter lament, so it does not end well with you, and your flesh and your body will be consumed. Now, there are, the book of Leviticus speaks, there were venereal diseases in the ancient world. They certainly didn't have anything like AIDS, but they had gonorrhea and things like that. The book of Leviticus vividly describes something of that sort. And that consumes the flesh and body. Venereal diseases physically disfigure one's sexual organs and, sometimes beyond itself. AIDS just weakens the whole body, but that is not something the ancients had to contend with. And she shall say, how I have hated discipline, and my heart has despised reproof. So if you do not embrace discipline, discipline is pain with long-term value, whereas pleasure is ultimately causes pain when we prioritize our immediate gratification at the expense of all else. We will invite pain, but if we embrace discipline, we will embrace pain for the educational and redemptive value. But that is nowhere on the mind of the adulterer or the adulteress. And I have not heeded the voice of my teachers, and I have not inclined my ear to those who instructed me. So the warnings that he earlier provides in this passage are there for a reason. It is to spare one of unnecessary pain, injury, ruin, and ultimately death, damnation, and destruction. So the voice of my teachers, the teachers tell you what you need to know, not everything you would like to hear, but it's still beneficial for you to know and understand and to contemplate and to think upon. And, those who instruct you exist to protect you and lead you away from that which is spiritually harmful. In a little while I was in all evil, in the midst of an assembly, in a congregation. Drink water from your own cistern, and running water from your own well. So sex is, in fact, divinely endorsed by God in marriage. So drink water from your own cistern. A wife is your possession. It's almost misleading to say possession, because we ought not think of women as items to be owned. But when you have a wife, she does in fact belong to you, and you belong to her. The two become joined into one flesh. And that should be, if a wife is not, you should not enter into a marriage if you're not going to be sexually satisfied with that one woman for the rest of your life. And one woman is sufficient to accommodate all the sexual urges and desires of a man, and vice versa in one life. Should your springs be scattered abroad, rivers of water in the street, let them be only your own, and let not for strangers with you. So again, that word strangers, the woman is likened, the immoral woman is likened to a strange woman. That means one who he is not related to by marriage. And of course, the term foreigner comes in the verse 10 we've already read. But let them only be your own. That means your wife, not anyone else's wife, or not anyone who is not your wife. It doesn't have to be someone else's wife. If it is, it's the sin of adultery. If they're not married, it's the sin of fornication. But both are equally sexual sin. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of your youth. So the wife of your youth, now the wife that you marry to is invariably physically more attractive in her youth, but when you age together with the right woman, you will not seek a younger woman for your sexual satisfaction, because your fountain will be blessed through a lifetime of enriching relationship. And of course, physical attraction is not the only criteria for a wife, the selection of a significant other. If that alone is not sufficient to build a marriage which will sustain and endure all the way till the end, till death do us part, that's the goal of marriage, the divorce rate is off the charts, and a relationship founded on nothing other than physical attractiveness cannot last. A loving deer and a pleasant doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times, and be captivated by her love always. So you really have to find that one woman who's going to be sufficient for your satisfaction, not just sexual, but spiritual. The bonds of marriage are more extensive and deep than physical pleasure alone, but also you want her to be your friend and a good mother and a good neighbor and just everything else. You don't want her just to be a trophy wife, one you can proudly display to your neighbors, because if you're selecting women based on, or men for that matter, based on physical attraction alone, then you're eventually and inevitably going to seek sexual satisfaction outside of one to whom you are married, because eventually that wife is going to get old as you age with the passage of time. For why should you, my son, be captivated by a strange woman and embrace the bosom of a foreigner? Now, the natural man knows the answer to that question. They are physically attractive. They are pleasing to the eyes. They are pleasing to the touch. They are pleasant to look at, pleasant to grasp and fondle. But, there's really no reason. Why should you be captivated by a strange woman, one who does not belong to you, one who is not your wife or someone else's wife? And that foreigner is also closely related verbally to strange woman. So this isn't one who doesn't share the same ethnic identity or background with you. It is anyone who is not you are not married to. For the ways of man are before the eyes of Yahweh, and he considers all his path. So every sexual sinner, they can get away with it for a while. Bill Cosby got away with drugging and sodomizing women for some 30 years, but eventually it caught up to him. So even if he got away with it for his life, he would have to answer for it at the judgment. And I'm not using Bill Cosby as a whipping boy. He's simply one of the more prominent figures who illustrates the destructive path. He has to spend the rest of his life in jail after the real Bill Cosby was miles away from the persona that he had crafted for himself on the Cosby Show. But Yahweh, nothing escapes his notice, and we all have to answer to it one day. Every idle word we ever spoken to will be held against us at the judgment. So certainly every moral or sexual indiscretion that we can trick the world and fool the world, but you can't fool Yahweh, you can't deceive him, you can't get away with it. Even if you do successfully suppress your adultery or sexual sin in this lifetime, you will have to answer for it in the life which comes after the next. And if you don't have anything worth answering for, because nothing escapes Yahweh, you're not going to have life after this life. You're going to be hellbound. And he considers all his paths, so that means he knows every way our mind is oriented. So when we commit adultery with the eyes, this also, in adultery in the heart, Matthew 5:28, this also does not escape the notice of Yahweh, and the Savior declared it the moral equivalent of adultery itself. So adultery is easy to say, oh, I've never done something like that. Everyone lies, everyone steals, everyone covets, everyone does just about most of the other transgressions in the Decalogue, but adultery is one that is sneaky because most people don't actually go through the act, but they all harbor lust in their heart, which is the moral equivalent of adultery. The wicked is entrapped in his own wickedness, and he is caught in the cords of his sin. He who sins is a slave to sin, we read in John 8:34. So the wicked will be entrapped in his own wickedness. So wickedness is a trap which the wicked ultimately succumb to, and they lay the spring of their own trap, and they are the wickedness, in this case the lust for sexual satisfaction, and they will be caught and have no means to escape once their sin finds them out, Numbers 23:32. He dies for lack of discipline, and in the greatness of his folly he goes astray. So discipline leads unto life, and a child without discipline is likened to a bastard, somewhere in the book of Hebrews. So discipline is of educational and redemptive value, so we must embrace the path of discipline. And I think the third chapter comments more extensively on the that he who Yahweh chastens, he also loves. And but in the greatness of his folly, now it is foolish to follow your own whims and desires, especially your carnal lust, that will lead you astray from the straight and narrow path to salvation onto the broad path, the broad way, which leads to death, damnation, destruction, and death. So we want to avoid that path. I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time. Take care until then. Bye-bye.